Hello everybody and welcome to Adobe Live. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we are creating and streaming from today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Flynn Tracy and I'm here with Tim Northey, aka TK North. TK, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I'm well. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I think I complimented you last week on your greenery in the background.
Foliage, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love it. Love seeing a bit of greenery in the office.
It's alive and real.
Alive and kicking.
Except this one, but
if you didn't point it out, I wouldn't have known any better. And I think I told you I have a couple of off-camera giant fiddle leaf fig that is not looking very good at the moment. Haven't done anything about that. Hi everybody, welcome to Adobe Live, the plant channel. If you're watching on YouTube or Behance, feel free to use chat as we are live today if you have questions on anything we're talking about. This is a two-part stream. Part one is today, right now, and the second part is on Thursday. So you can catch it live if you're watching the replay. Thank you for watching. But yeah, if you're live, you can throw in questions as we're rolling along. Today, we're focusing on the photography part of photography, which seemed like a good place to start, TK.
Yeah, so I guess whenever we talk about kind of getting into photography, it's hard to understand for most people if we start with kind of the real basics or whether we jump into a little bit more. So I've tried to cover a little bit of both, kind of some of the basic things we need to get started and then hopefully diving into stuff that's a little bit more interesting as well.
Yeah. Super cool. Yeah. So what we do here on Adobe Live, if you're new to the channel or anything like that, we pick an area of focus each month, most of the time. And this month is photography. So if you're brand new and you're looking for a video or you want to brush up on some fundamentals and things like that, that's what we kind of have prepared. And that's why we've got the amazing TK here to chat through things. But if you have a question that's off topic, that's totally fine. Throw it in chat. That's the good thing about being live, so we can ask TK all the questions. But for those who might not be familiar with your work, can you give us a bit of a rundown of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I consider myself mostly as a photographer. I do a lot of video as well, so videographer. I share most of my stuff, I guess, mostly on Instagram and now YouTube. So through YouTube, I try and teach photography as well as kind of sharing, I guess, my photography journey and different videos along the way to that. So that's I guess YouTube and Instagram are my kind of socials that I'm focused on at the moment. But outside that, I do a few weddings and other things for clients as well. So yeah, largely photography stuff.
Yeah, super cool. So TikTok hasn't lured you in yet?
It hasn't. It's one of those things where you feel the pressure that should I, but that form of content doesn't interest me a lot, so it's always given me a bit of pushback, but it's becoming so popular it's kind of hard to ignore in a way as well. Yeah,
I hear you, I understand, but it's a whole nother thing to manage, isn't it? A whole nother format, whole nother, has its own thing. That's exactly. Super great. So just checking in with chat as well. Hello, Johanna, looking after us with all the useful links and things like that today. Anita, hello. Ung and Benjamin Lee, Ichiban is in the chat. You did promise you would come in, and it's very lovely to see you. Daniel here as well. Yes, it is lunchtime, so yeah, grab a lunch bag and sit back and enjoy the stream.
Listen to some photography stuff.
Yeah, listen to some photography stuff. That's what we should have called. That's what we should have called this stream.
I think so.
should we jump into it then? Jump over to
sure.
Everything. This is really cool. How do you take a photo like this without I don't know. I feel like I would, in front of a mirror. I feel like I would stuff it up.
So all these weird photos like this are usually for thumbnails,
right.
For YouTube. I don't use these photos for anything other than YouTube thumbnails, really. So this was one that was, becoming a photographer that I just shot here with a light, set up a tripod and timer it type thing. So, so let's get started, I guess. So getting started with photography, there's so many different things we could jump into with this, and I've tried to touch on a lot of them. So we'll see how we go. I guess a good place to start is how we consider photography. So for me, it's this interesting kind of intersection between a real science, and that's more the technical side of things, versus art. So this is what I guess when we're getting started, makes it challenging because you do need to kind of have that rough understanding of more of the science and the technical side of it to be able to create and get a bit creative with what you're doing. But that's what I love about it, because this interesting intersection, I like the technical side of it, but I like that there's so many different directions you can take it as well. So that's the thing I really love about photography.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and like what might draw you to photography, right? Like might be a designer or an artist and you're very interested in the medium, kind of come from that way, or, you know, could have like be quite technical and really enjoy the technical side of things and think, well, how can I be a bit more creative with how, you know, how much I love this technical kind of thing. So I quite like that. It's like a Venn diagram.
Yeah, and I guess this is, the more we can master that technical side of it, it really pushes you to experiment more with the creative side of it. So the more you jump in and learn those different technical skills, it really opens up different possibilities with what you can do with it as well. So the next one's just the interesting thing to consider, which I kind of see discussed over different parts of the internet. So I'm just adjusting my chair. When is photography photography? When does a photo become art? Or is all photography already art? It's
not the photos I take.
Still art, I guess. It's your expression.
Maybe, yeah.
But I guess for me, it's there's no set line in this. It's really up to your kind of personal opinion and where you want to take a photo. So if you want to open it up in Photoshop and manipulate it, that's really up to you and your kind of freedom. Whether that's how far you push that, whether it's still a photo, that's where I guess people like to kind of debate. But for me, I'll show you, I guess, what I kind of do. So this is a bit of a before and after, which
wow,
I think we'll go through this one on Thursday, how I edited this, when we'll look more at the editing side of things. But yeah, so you can see for me, like I still make some pretty decent changes to the photo. This one, there's a little bit of Photoshop getting rid of the rock down in the left-hand corner, which just created a bit more kind of negative space. You can see colors hasn't changed dramatically, but it's a bit different. And there's just this extra light source that I've kind of added in to make it a little bit more interesting, which I would say is probably on the heavier side of photo editing, but without changing it too much. So that's basically what I do.
So adding in like an entirely new light source is like you consider that quite a heavy side of things. Does that mean that you do it when you like kind of need to, or you try not to do it? Is that, or?
I tend to do it because the way I look at a photo is when I'm editing, I want to make this photo look as good as I can, what I think looks good.
Right.
So I'm not someone that looks at a photo and thinks, I want to make this look as realistic as possible, which might be some people's interpretation of photography or what they want to do with a photo. But in saying that, I probably don't push it to too extreme. Like if you're adding in light, you want to add in light where it would naturally, hopefully, be kind of sitting in the image anyway, so it doesn't look too kind of unnatural in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Which we'll get to next week, but you can see in this one, the light it's coming from behind the rock, so it makes it look more realistic. Whereas if I had that light source covering that rock as well, it would look a bit unnatural. So that's where different tools in Lightroom can really help as well. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Great. I love this. I love how it's been framed with the rocks. Like, and you get much more sense of dread and adventure with the rock down the bottom gone. Like with it there, you kind of get the sense that it's all sort of sloping down. But as soon as that's gone, I'm like, dude, get away from the edge. Like that's so dangerous. Please get away from the edge.
Yeah. So this is actually Pat K, who
Pat K
jumped, standing in this photo on that edge. It was quite a sketchy spot. I'm not a fan.
So it was actually a sketchy spot. Okay, cool.
I didn't really go down to where he was, but it was more to get around this cliff face that was a little bit sketchy, and I'm not a big fan of those situations.
Just send Pat K. Also, Dennis Russley in the chat as well. Hello, Dennis.
Hello, Dennis. Yeah. So I guess that's what I do. I thought we'd move on to kind of a question getting into photography that I get asked a lot. I'm sure a lot of people get asked a lot is, what camera do I use, or what camera should you be using? This type of question. And I guess there's no short answer in a way to kind of quickly give someone.
Well, those are the good questions. That's why these questions are asked all the time, right? Because there isn't an answer. It's this exactly. In this particular situation, or personal preference might be for this. This might be your budget. This, might be your experience or your goals.
Factors.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Cool. And so what are your thoughts? Where do you start with this question?
I think the common answer that I hear a lot, and I agree with it to some extent, is the best camera is the one you have on you. So
right.
Whether that's a phone or whatever you can afford, your budget allows for, it's true to some extent, because obviously without a camera on you, you can't take a photo. So whatever you have access to, whatever you have at the current moment is obviously the best option you have. If you're looking to get something upgrade, there's plenty of different options. I will go through probably where I recommend different cameras in a sec. So but for most people, we start on mobile, or I guess this is the most accessible way, because pretty much everyone has a mobile. So pretty much everyone has access to a reasonable camera. This shot on the right was on a mobile. So mobiles these days, they give us lots of options when it comes to photography, like long exposures, lots of different modes and settings. You can shoot RAW on a lot of mobiles now even. So it's really opened up photography and experimenting with photography to a lot more people. Here's a couple more shots taken on a phone. The biggest thing for me where phones are still a little bit behind is, so this example on the left, you can see we have nice separation between the background and subject, what we call bokeh. But I can't zoom in here, I should have done another slide. You can still see how the edges are really soft around the hair right. Here especially, and also on the dress. Most of these effects are created more by software, AI type things. When we're creating this depth of field in a camera, they can do it to some degree, but they're just not as sharp, and you get these really soft edges, especially hair. If you've ever tried to take a photo of you like a glass on an right. iPhone with portrait mode, you notice it'll just blur out the whole glass because it can't recognize the subject.
Oh, so really? I haven't tried that. I'm going to try that.
They might be getting better. Maybe It's been too long since I've tried that, but they're still a little bit behind. And this is like where you're creating this naturally in a good camera and lens system. A phone is still largely trying to do this software based, so it's not perfect, and it still gives us interesting results. But if you compare the two, they're just still quite different in the end. So that would probably be the biggest thing for me, the depth that you can create on a proper camera lens system. Yeah,
that's cool.
So if you are shooting on a phone, when should you kind of make the switch or look to make the switch? And I guess the biggest thing for me is if you really want to take it a bit further, experiment a little bit more, perhaps doing more professional or paid work as a photographer, you may need to invest in a camera system. That's things like client work, weddings. Now you can still shoot these things on mobiles, and I'm sure it's been done. But in most situations, you're probably going to want to pick up a decent camera when you're doing those type of things. yeah. I can just imagine my wife at the wedding, if I hired a photographer and they turn up just with a mobile phone. Turn up with a mobile?
Might be living by myself at the moment. That's just my situation. We do have a question, which I think we might jump to. So thanks, Misty, for the question. If you guys have questions as we're rolling along, please feel free to throw them in chat. The question is, how do we get good lighting on the face? The background story is they just took graduation photos of their daughter, but her face is in shadow in most of them.
So I go into what makes a good photo in a sec, and lighting is one of the key things that in any photos, light's everything essentially. If we didn't have light, we wouldn't have a photo. So light is everything. When you're taking a photo like that, and it's hard if you're in a scene that you can only shoot in one direction, for example, because you're stuck with that way. If the light's on the face, great. If it's not, if you don't really have any other options, it's quite hard. But the answer is to find where the light is coming from and move your subject so the light is more on the face, which, whether that's natural light from the sun, whether it's from artificial light. I've got a light on here now, so my face is lit up a little bit, otherwise it would be quite dark. So it's hard when you're just taking general snaps at a graduation. If you've got a really nice background one way, but the light's not the right direction, you have to either weigh up whether you want the nice background or you want the light on the face, which might be facing a crowd or a building. So yeah, it's tricky in those situations, but that's basically what you have to weigh up.
Very cool. And we'll be doing some editing tips and stuff on Thursday as well, so maybe we could chat a little bit about salvaging something.
Yeah, exactly. So that's option 2. You can salvage a lot in Lightroom and stuff, and brighten up the faces if you know how to.
There we go. That's great. Just a reminder, throw in questions if you got them while we jump back into. So back to the presentation. I love this angle.
Yeah, so stuff like this, obviously I wouldn't take a phone to these type of client jobs, but as I've seen videos, I'm shooting weddings on iPhone or whatever, so it's possible, but that's where I would obviously recommend making the switch if you're getting serious about it and you want to do a bit more professional work or whatever it may be. So, and this is for me just the difference, the kind of the depth and compression you can create, and just the image quality if you move into a camera system is going to be far greater. So the next question, what type of camera, whether you kind of go for a little compact, which is the one on the right, or whether you go for a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. So for me, I have my other camera here. It's a mirrorless camera, and that's pretty much what I would recommend for most people. DSLR in the past was what pretty much all professionals were using, but they're largely not being made anymore. So mirrorless is really the kind of the future in the meantime, at least.
So my question for me, like, what's the difference between DSLR and mirrorless?
It's basic. So the end result will be quite the same, but one has it's just the mechanics, and one has a mirror, one doesn't.
Right.
So the way it actually captures the image is slightly different. And mirrorless, they've just become more popular because they're slightly better in things like low light, and they just allow you to add in a lot more to the camera that was quite difficult when we were using DSLRs. All
right, cool. I have to check that out. I didn't realize there was such a big difference.
So the lenses can be quite similar. A lot of them you can adapt the same lenses even, but it's just a kind of change that's happened within more recent years from DSLR to mirrorless.
Yeah, cool. We do have another question, if you don't mind. What is TK's favorite form of photography? From YouTube, over on YouTube.
My favorite is street photography.
Yeah.
So it wasn't initially. I found it too hard. I found it too awkward. I didn't like shooting strangers, which I think is why a lot of people don't get into it. But for me, it's just candid moments feel more natural. They're not like you're just shooting what you see. It can be challenging at times. It's rewarding when you find an interesting scene or an interesting character on the street and you capture them in an interesting way. So I think that's why I like it so much.
Yeah.
They're the things but landscape and kind of travel photography is what brought me to photography. So that's close behind.
Nice. Oh, very cool.
Yeah. Right. So lastly, compact camera is probably just a bit of a step up from, say, a mobile. So it's more of a fixed lens, so it doesn't give you the option to maybe upgrade lenses later on, can be like a handy travel type of camera for a lot of people, I guess. But yeah, for most people, I guess mirrorless is probably the best option. And For me, it doesn't really matter what system you go for in terms of brand. Just because they're used more broadly, I would recommend Canon or Sony, because if you need to borrow lenses, whatever, these are what more people are using. So it makes it a bit easier, and it's a little bit future proof if you know other people and they're still selling a lot of cameras and a lot of people are using their lenses, that they should continue to upgrade and manufacture these type of lenses.
I love this photo of the bag, that it has the type of lenses just like on a piece of tape, so you don't have to pick it up and look at it and put it back down. I love that sort of thing, like a little insight into saving that couple of seconds every time you're trying to switch.
This is literally at weddings when you look down at your bag and you can see all these lens caps which look exactly the same, and you just need to grab it quickly. It's very useful. So I don't want to spend much time on this. This is the technical side of focal length. Hopefully most of us understand what focal length is. If you don't, it's obvious. It's essentially, looking at it, is how zoomed in your image is going to be. And this is what varies most with lens to lens, is the focal length. So how much angle of view it allows us to either zoom in or shoot quite widely. Now, obviously, different focal lengths are more suited to different types of photography. So if you're looking at which lenses to buy, it probably varies a lot depending on what type of photography you're interested in or what you want to maybe shoot in the future. So as an example, more portrait photography on the left here. For me, I love both 35, 50mm for portrait, even 85. And this is pretty common, a little bit wider and sometimes even a little bit more zoomed in is still done, but these are probably the most common focal lengths for portraits. Jumping over to landscape images on the right, obviously nice wide open landscape, often a wider lens can be better. So things like cityscapes, landscapes, architecture, even things like real estate where you're in a small space and need to fit in as much as possible.
Right.
You want a nice wide lens. So 15 is pretty wide. It's great for those type of scenarios.
Yeah, so if you're a real estate agent, it's definitely the 15mm lens. We've seen
make everything look as big as possible.
Wide angle, yeah. It's always funny when you look at it and then you kind of compare it, and like the fridge is like this thin or something. You know, it's because of the proportions, the way
distortion.
It's shot. Yeah. It's always great. It's like, okay, look at that fridge. I'm pretty sure they used a wide angle lens of some kind here. Yeah. We won't go into city property. We'll be here. That's all we talk about. Demis in chat is saying 12mm is the way to go. There we go.
Yeah, so Demis loves his architecture, loves his big wide open. So for him, 12mm makes a lot of sense. Yeah. For me, 15's wide enough for most things, but yeah. And then obviously tele lens. So this allows us to zoom in a long way, really good for sports, wildlife, all those things where you need that extra reach, or even things like this if you want to shoot moon or more zoomed in landscapes. Obviously having a tele lens can be really nice as well. So lots of different types of lenses. I guess the two main ones, zoom lenses, prime lenses. As the name suggests, zoom lens just allows you to zoom in. Prime lens is fixed at one focal length. So 50mm prime, 35mm prime. And the advantages of prime lenses and why you would opt for a prime lens, even though it's just fixed at one, little bit less versatile, stuck at one focal length, is because it usually allows for a wider aperture. So things like this, where you're getting really kind of blurred background, you're going to shoot on a prime lens because you can shoot at a lot larger aperture. Things like landscapes, zoom lens is probably going to be a lot better option because you want that versatility to zoom in and out, and having that really large aperture is not quite as important. Things like portraits, for me, I like to shoot very wide open, which like a larger aperture as possible, which just makes the subject stand out a lot. You can see how much the subject is standing out from the background. There's real blurring of the background. These are all shot at pretty large aperture, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8.
And how, just on that type of shot back there, how close are you to the subject in this case? If you're using, like, if you're quite zoomed in, like, are you on the other side of the room? Like, are you like super close, but you still zoom in a lot and take a fairly crop shot? Like, where are you in relation?
So these are three different lenses, I think, from memory. So left we have like 50 mil, 35 mil, and then a 135. So the one on the right I was quite far away. The other two, I was quite close.
Cool.
And that's why 35 and 50 are really nice for portraits as well, because you have that interaction. You're quite close to your subject. It's quite a natural focal length for our eyes as well.
Cool.
Just some more examples of aperture. I guess if you're starting out and you're just buying into a camera system, what lenses should you start with is another kind of common question. And for me, I would probably start with one zoom lens and one prime lens if your budget allows to at least get a couple of lenses. The reason I would do this, zoom lens, again, a little bit more versatile, 24-70 is a really good lens to start with. And then the prime lens at least allows you to play around a little bit more with aperture and that depth of field, because usually they'll have a larger aperture.
Yeah, cool. I think that's good advice. Yeah, if you could pick any two lenses to get started, because it can be quite expensive, right? So it's always good to know where to kind of kick off. You can spend a lot of money on photography.
You can, and lenses are just as important as your camera. So yeah, and then another good thing about picking up maybe one prime lens is you can pick up like a 50mm 1.8, which allows you to experiment with shallow depth of field a bit, but you can pick them up a bit cheaper as well. So it's a good place to start. So next, I just wanted to go into kind of, I guess, we look at a photo, we know, I like that, it looks nice, but why do we like it? Like what about that photo makes it a good photo? Which we probably don't think about too much sometimes. And until recently, I probably didn't think too much. I know what I liked, I just kind of did it.
Yeah.
But it is good to think about. So for any photo, these three key elements pretty much are everything. So our overall composition, the light, and the subject, of course. So if we go into each of those, first one, composition, hopefully kind of have roughly understand everything that you can see in the photo and how you choose to arrange that, essentially. Whether you choose to put your subject kind of in the center, off to the side, this is all your framing and your composition. So when you're getting started, there's lots of different rules. A real common one is the rule of thirds. I don't know if you've heard of this. I don't like the word rule because it makes you think, okay, I have to do this. Yeah. Whereas it's more of, it's like a guideline you can occasionally do or experiment with. It can lead to really nice, compelling images. So it's one you should have an understanding of. But I think the more you take photos, you understand where you might want to opt for one type of composition. You might opt for rule of thirds, or you might center your subject, or something completely different, and you'll work out what works for you, and the more you practice. So it's really one of those things, understanding these helps you experiment, but you still need to experiment.
Yeah, I like that. It's like the theory of thirds. I have that on my phone. I actually find it really useful on my phone, but it's mostly just to line things up. Like if I want to line the horizon up, or if I want to line like a building up or something like that. Again, I'm just taking like happy snaps of the family that sit on my phone until my phone's full and I have to back it up. But it's still nice to get to use them. So I use them in that sense.
Yeah, and that's why, or even phones, cameras, you can always turn on your thirds grid. If you don't know the rule of thirds, basically it's placing your subject on one of these intersection points. So you can use it just like lining the horizon up with the third, or you can actually place your kind of subject on that intersection point.
Yep.
So just some examples of composition. This one, our kind of horizon line kind of lines up with a third. So does this subject, but the subject is centered rather than kind of on one of these vertical thirds. So again, this would, you look at that, you depend where you want to kind of aim your photo.
Just on that in terms of composition, and if I'm jumping ahead, say we'll get to it. But I noticed that in a lot of these landscape images, there's a subject. There's someone. Yep. There's someone there. So I'm imagining that's intentional. Can you tell us why that is?
I guess it goes on to the third element, the subject. It just makes it, for me, more interesting for something like this. It gives you a lot of scale. If you took that person out, sure, it would just nice landscape, but it just gives you that scale, and it gives you that greater sense of awe when you've got a small person, especially. And similar to the one with PK in it, without that person, interesting, but it's just not quite as interesting. It doesn't give it that, as you kind of said, it's nearly scary in a way, looking at him on that cliff face for me, because I hate heights. But
yeah, it's like that call of the void feeling in your stomach a little bit.
Yeah, so it just, I guess it brings more emotion to photos as well in that sense.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
So next one, again, another example. Again, it's kind of using thirds, but the subject's not directly on one of those grid thirds. So you can pick and choose where this works and where it doesn't. Composition using negative space is also a really interesting technique to play around with. You notice in a lot of these, intentionally, I've got a lot of negative space in the sky. Same with this one. This one's got even more negative space. It's just useful to, I guess, not make our image too busy that we don't know where to look. It can kind of guide us to a subject better. Lots of reasons to use negative space and to play around with negative space.
Yeah, cool. Just checking in with chat as well. There's a couple of questions I think maybe I missed and maybe we've covered, so we'll come back to them if we have time today. But we do have another one. What's your hair routine, TK?
Who was
apparently YouTube says, what's TK's hair routine? Ha ha ha, looking great. I'm insulted. You know, I could have said both your hair looks great. That's okay. I haven't even put a brush in my hair. Thanks, man. I was fishing hard, wasn't I? And the other question from Jam, maybe that's Jam too, no, who knows? Hey TK, how do you store lenses? Do you leave them in the bag or have a particular storage solution? So
let's touch on the first one very quick. Got out of shower, bit of like hair stuff, brush it back. That's it.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow. It's that easy.
Yeah. Let's move on from that.
All right.
Next question, a very good question. So more recently, I have purchased a kind of glass cabinet, which, where's my frame? You can just see in the corner there.
Yeah, just in the corner, yep.
It's actually from IKEA. And this just stops my lenses getting dusty. So this is a really great place to store lenses, because lenses can look great stored on a nice shelf or like in the background of a YouTube video on a shelf. But they get so dusty if you leave them out. So having a cabinet like this is great, whether that's just a regular cabinet. It doesn't have to be glass if you don't want to display them, make them obvious. Sometimes I'll leave them in my bag if I'm lazy, but generally I try and store them in a cabinet. Cool.
There you go. Useful not to get dust. Yeah, I guess if they're sitting there for a while and they're accumulating dust, it's not great.
Yeah, they get dusty quickly.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the questions. All right, we'll move back along.
Yeah, next one. So just some more examples. We'll move on there. The next one, our next key element, light. So as I've got here, light is everything, which is true. Light's what creates a photo. Without light, we have nothing. So, but the thing we need to experiment with light, and this probably goes back to that question earlier, is shooting directly into sunlight. How's that going to affect your image? Sunlight coming from the side, some bright sunlight during the day from above. how's this going to affect your image? And there's lots of this really depends on what type of photography you're shooting. A good friend of mine who shoots a lot more portraits and is a lot better at it than me gave me some good advice on this. I've heard him talk about it, is that when you're shooting portraits, our eye is kind of wherever that light source is, our eye is ultimately going to look at that. So you do want some light on the face if possible. So something to consider when you're shooting portraits. You don't have to always do this. There's lots of creative portraits you can shoot where that's not true, whether you're shooting kind of into direct light. But I think that's good advice when you're shooting portraits for sure.
Nice. It's a good tip.
For landscapes, this can really vary. So the light in this image, it's a nice composition. We've got kind of the mountain kind of almost cutting the image in half diagonally. We've got this mountain peak, which is kind of sitting on that rule of thirds grid line. But if you take the light away from the mountain, it would make it far less interesting. In my opinion, it would just be the mountain there. So light really is important as well. This is just another example of kind of opposite to the portrait example, how you can use shooting directly into a light source and create more of a silhouette, which is, I guess, a little bit more creative. You can shoot portraits like this. You can shoot street photography like this, which makes for interesting. But that's where experimenting with light in different directions and how it's going to affect your image and having understanding of that can really help as well. That's
cool. Just on that one, dumb question. So it's because it's nighttime. There's not a lot of light coming, from this way, from our side, but there's a very, very strong light coming from behind. So it's creating the silhouette effect when you're taking the photo.
Yeah, you're shooting into a brighter light and there's no real light source coming directly in this way. So they'll come more dark. You could try and brighten that up, but they're going to be quite dark. So that's the same way now that I've got this light source on my face. I've got a bit of a window here. So without this, I would almost be silhouetted, like I'd be in the dark. So it's just something, obviously, the more you play around with photos, you'll understand how different light sources and direction will affect your photos.
Yeah, cool.
I'll just move on. The next one, obviously, subject. So these three, without one, you really don't have an interesting photo. If you think of what's something really uninteresting, an empty toilet roll sitting there, it's got really nice light hitting it, nice composition, you still don't really have a nice photo. So you need all three elements and to kind of work together, and without them your photo is probably not going to be as interesting.
No, that's really cool. That actually leads me to a question that we did have up before. Misty was asking, so do you tell the person on the cliff to stay until you get the pic? My understanding, that was Pat K, so you're like a team of photographers going out, so I imagine you're taking turns kind of posing or being being the subject.
Yeah,
that's my guess.
In most situations that's true. This one was more, so I nearly didn't go around this cliff face, which is why I got this shot in the end.
Right.
So I was like, nah, I don't want it anyway. I'd rather stay here on the safe ground. So I was hanging back, and then I eventually decided, okay, I'll go around slowly. And Pat was just standing there pondering, looking out into the valley, pondering life, I guess. So I managed, as I was walking along the cliff face, to just frame that up. So I didn't have to direct or do too much there, but usually on something like that you would be, and would take turns if need be, or get someone to do something, put a camera on a tripod if you need to.
Yeah. You ever considered like making just a cardboard cutout of Pat and just carrying it around, plant it down, and then you can all get the shot
in a specific pose? That would be quite a good idea.
It's the same pose in like every situation.
Anyway, might have to try that.
Give it a go.
Yeah, so I guess subject's obviously hugely important. It doesn't matter how good the lighting is, how good your composition is. If your subject's not very interesting, then it's probably not going to be a very interesting photo. So these two examples, this is a Japanese snow festival, quite an interesting subject. This one, just the huts would be the subject and the mountain in the background. So just the way they line up for me made this kind of an interesting subject. So your subject can be anything. It doesn't have to be a person. When we say subject, it's whatever, I guess, the main thing is in your photo. So these two examples, the one on the right, the interesting subject isn't a subject, it's a group. It's a lot of people that are, I guess, would be the subject that make it kind of interesting. The one on the left for me, the subject doesn't, it's a nice kind of image, but the subject doesn't stand out enough to make it a really compelling image. If there was a little bit more light on the subject and drawing my eyes to that more, I'd like it a bit more. But for me, the mountains are probably what you draw your eyes to looking at this photo. So that's what we need to consider, along with framing and composition, is drawing our eye into the subject, I guess.
Cool.
And this next one, I guess, subject's just made a little bit more interesting by throwing another element in, capturing the hat as it was kind of thrown. The one on the right, the subject, you could say, is the building, but again, it's made a little bit more interesting by the traffic, which is part of the subject as well. Without that, not quite as interesting. So those three things are essentially together what make up any good photo and what make a photo interesting to look at.
Yeah, cool. For the hat one, when you're doing stuff like that, does she actually throw the hat, or do you have like the hat on a clip above the camera and then
that
you blur
probably
it
would
out?
have been easier, but actually I think I tried this shot 3 times and the best one was the first one, so I got lucky. But
All right.
yeah, she was actually throwing it.
Did you get hit in the head with the hat?
She probably throw it at me and go, why are you making me do this?
Yeah.
Nah. So I guess the next part I had kind of looking at settings. I don't want to spend too much time on this because hopefully most people have a pretty basic understanding of settings. If not, these topics, there's plenty of good information out there. If you don't quite understand anything, go and dive into it in more detail, because I think, as I've got here, like, we make adjustments to settings, obviously for technical reasons, to allow appropriate amount of light and expose our photos properly. But a lot of the times we're changing settings for more creative reasons within that kind of technical range as well. So that's where you need a really good understanding of your settings. And if you're not familiar with them, so if you're not familiar with the exposure triangle, really jump in and kind of understand these 3 settings. This is essentially what you need to understand as a photographer.
Cool.
Yeah. So I won't go spend too much time on the technical side of things, but let's go through some examples of where you might use, starting with aperture, different apertures. Technical side, obviously, larger the aperture, larger the opening, the more light that's going to be entered into the camera. More narrow, less light. So that, but also with aperture, we know larger aperture means basically just smaller part of the image is going to be in focus. So with this one, most of the image is in focus. We can see Mount Fuji in the backgrounds in focus, as well as the pagoda, the building here. So this is a smaller aperture.
Right.
Again, this one, most of the image is in focus. So this for landscape photography, usually where you can get away with shooting at higher f-stop numbers, which is a smaller aperture.
Right. Cool. And this is typically, you would have that like set down on a tripod or sitting down, because if you move it a little bit, it's going to kind of go a bit crazy.
Yeah, and that's the advantage of when you're shooting landscape. You don't need a really your shutter speed you can play around with so much, because often you can shoot on a tripod as well. There's not too much moving in the scene. Talking about this next one, so if you're shooting anything like product photography, food photography, fashion photography, anything where you're showing off a garment, food, whatever it is, you want most of that in focus. You won't want half the food to be all blurry in most situations. So this is where you'd probably pick an aperture somewhere in the middle, 5.6, around that, where you're still getting some depth, but at least most of what you're trying to show is in focus. So this example here, if I shot at say like 1.4, you might find the bag is in focus, but maybe the headphones are blurry because it's just a too shallow depth of field. So that's where somewhere in the middle for these type of things can work a bit better. And then, as I touched on, for portraits, I really like to shoot with nice large aperture, get that real shallow depth of field, can make your subject really stand out and really blur the background.
Yeah, cool. Makes sense. Hey everyone, we've got about 8 minutes left, I think, today. So feel free to throw any last minute questions in chat as we're going along. And just for you as well, TK, just so you know how long we've got left.
Yeah, cool. I guess we can go through the next stuff quite quickly, because stuff like shutter speed, I've just got different examples of where you might choose a faster shutter speed, where you might want to slow it down a little bit. So fast shutter speed is obviously anything where we want to freeze a moment in time, where you want to get an exact time slice of what's happening. There's nothing moving through your frame. It's like freezing motion in a way. So that can be anything from, so 1/400 is a decent starting point, but even 1/200 is usually fast enough for most things to get a nice, sharp, clear image. If we're shooting long exposure, that's where we can really play around with shutter speed, because especially if you're shooting on a tripod, this was 30 seconds and you can do things like light painting, long exposures. This one, just a car driving down the road, creates that effect from having the shutter open long enough. I think the thing with both shutter speed and aperture is we need to understand how they work technically, but again, usually you're changing them for these creative reasons at the end of the day. So without that basic understanding first, it's hard to go out and make those decisions.
Yeah, for sure.
Again, faster shutter speed, freezing motion. 1 second, not a real long shutter speed, but because the water's moving quite quickly, creates that kind of effect. Again,
Ichiban in chat, I don't know which photo he was talking about, but he says, cool photo, looks like a magazine cover.
Oh, yeah, inside joke. No,
this is the inside joke I said he would throw in chat. Yep.
He was there, but that photo was on a magazine is what he's touching.
All right, okay, cool.
I think we all got similar photos though, which can often happen when you're at a place like that.
Right. So you go in a group and everyone kind of gets a similar sort of shot.
Yeah, I think it depends who you're with. Like, I think our stuff varies enough that it comes out different, but sometimes there'll be some that maybe are a bit more similar.
Yeah.
Just playing around with shutter speed is another example of shooting handheld, but where you've got movement in the background. So if I shot this at a real fast shutter speed, again, you just get a clean snapshot of the train. It wouldn't be blurred like this. So playing around with shutter speed, working out how long you can keep some of your image sharp and clear by slowing your shutter speed, but not too much. This is an example of that. Things like panning shots are another example of playing around with shutter speed. This is essentially where you pick a slower shutter speed, but not too slow, and you're essentially trying to match the movement. So if you can move at the exact same speed as the subject, whether it's a car, someone on a bike, a person running, they are going to still be clear if your shutter speed's at a reasonable interval, not too slow, not too fast, but the background will start to blur. So that's how you create these, by following the subject while the shutter's open.
Oh, cool. So you kind of track them with your camera as they're
Yeah, and that's why if you pick a real slow shutter speed, it's too hard to track them exactly. So you need it to be something like this, 1/10, 1/20 can be slow enough where you can practice. It's tricky, but it's actually really fun to play around with as well. Similar thing with cars. If you're in another car shooting a second car, which is often how commercials and different things are shot, if you're matching that speed, you can slow down the shutter speed and get this kind of effect where the car will be still sharp and the background will be more blurry. Just thinking, move on to questions, or how are we looking?
Yeah, we've only got a few minutes left, so that's kind of perfect if we want to jump over to a couple of questions. So, question from YouTube: what is your take on film photography? Is it making a comeback?
Yes. If you've tried to purchase any film stock recently, it's becoming very difficult. So I feel like
really?
It's only getting. Well, some of the film that I like shooting on, Color Plus is one of them, if anyone's interested. It's become really hard to get and the price keeps going up. So that's a pretty good indicator, right? Because I'm sure they would like to sell more film, but if it's in such high demand and they can't, then yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think it's like vinyl. It's one of those things that has a...
Right.
I think it's becoming more popular in some ways, and definitely going to be around for a bit longer, that's for sure.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, how about one more question? This is a question before from over on YouTube. How do we select lenses based on our type of photography if we haven't used this lens before? I think we covered it, but I don't know if you had anything to add to that question, because I think that question came just as we were finished, moved on to the lens part. But
yeah, hopefully you kind of covered it. The focal length will definitely depend on what type of photography you like to shoot, which hopefully we touched on.
Yeah.
Same as how large how wide the aperture is for that particular lens might depend whether you want to shoot people, portraits, or different things. So,
cool.
Yeah, I think I've got a video just on lenses talking about those type of things. So,
well, speaking of which, so you have a YouTube channel as well that has lots of tips and advice, and we cover some of the subjects that we've covered today as well. So can we give that a bit of a plug before we jump off today?
Sure. Yeah. Did you want me to pull it up?
We might just, is there a short link, or people just search TK North, right? I'm concerned about running out of time.
Should hopefully pop up, TK North.
It's also in a link to TK's Instagram website and YouTube down the bottom if you're watching the replay on YouTube. It's also down the bottom on Behance, actually, so it's on the bottom everywhere. But yeah, cool. Thank you so much, TK. That's going to do us for today. Everyone, we will be back on Thursday. Just like we focused on photography and digital photography, in today's session, we'll be focusing on editing. So what do you do when you do get that photo? What edits might you want to make, and what apps might you want to use? I'm really looking forward to it, TK. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, Thursday editing is my favorite part, so it should be fun.
Oh yes. All right. We'll see you Thursday. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time on Adobe Live.
Thanks guys. Thanks for the questions.
Bye.